All right, we'll give everybody a couple seconds to trickle in here and then we can get started. All right, hello everyone and thank you for joining us for today's webinar brought to you by Nutrien. My name is Quentin Moorhead. I'm the National Account Manager of Top Crop Manager in Potatoes Canada. I'm joined today by Dr. Christy Preston, Senior Agronomist with Nutrien. Today during our session, Christy will discuss the benefits of the latest, most efficient system for delivering sulfur and phosphate to meet your crop's needs, Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST. Thank you to Nutrien for sponsoring our session today. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all attendees and registrants approximately 24 hours after our live broadcast. This session is scheduled to run for approximately 60 minutes. Christy will speak for about 45 minutes, and following her presentation, we'll open the floor to questions. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them into the questions tab found on your computer screen. This webinar has been approved for 1 CCA CEU in nutrient management. Further instructions for submission will follow the presentation. Without further ado, I'll let Dr. Christy Preston take it away.
All right, thank you, Quentin, and good morning, all. Welcome to 2022. So we're ready to kick off this year with some good research that we've had over the past couple of years. Again, we're going to talk about seed safety today and some application flexibility that we have with our Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST or MAP MST, whichever way you'd like to pronounce it is fine with us. It is a 943-016 product. And let's get started. So for seed safety, there are several considerations, whether it is abiotic stresses, so weather playing a role in how we apply fertilizer. If we're applying large amounts of fertilizer, are there limitations for nutrient application rates that I have to consider? We'll talk about seed bed utilization and maybe some equipment differences that would affect how much fertilizer you would be able to apply in furrow. We'll talk about a couple of different crops since we can treat canola and wheat both differently. We'll go into fertilizer sources, need to make sure that if we are applying fertilizer close to the seed, that we're not unknowingly applying the wrong fertilizer source and potentially causing a lot of issues. And we'll break that down by nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And we'll throw potassium in there too. Even though potassium's not in the Smart Nutrition product. And we'll talk a little bit more about application flexibility with this Smart Nutrition product. Now, I added this picture last minute because it's in a lot of our advertisements, but the main point that I like to drive is the soil is your most powerful machine. If you take care of it, it will result in high crop yields. And so it's your powerful machine. Let's take care of it. Let's give it what it needs and hopefully maximize crop production this upcoming year. So abiotic stresses that we need to look at whenever we're thinking about seed safety are the conditions going to be dry. Now, this past year, specifically in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, early on, it may have been a little wet, but it was dry kind of around that planting time and during early growth. If there's not a lot of moisture, that means that the fertilizer that's applied close to the seed, it's not going to be able to be diluted. And I've included here also that soil texture plays a big role in determining seed application rates. If you have a high textured soil, that soil has the ability to absorb nutrients from the fertilizer applications and be able to pull it away from the seed. If you have coarser textured soils, then the soil doesn't have those charges to pull, say, like ammonium from ammonium source fertilizers. Therefore, if you don't have a lot of moisture in the soil at planting or soon after, you're not going to dilute that fertilizer. You're not going to be able to pull it away from the seed. And what's going to happen is that fertilizer is going to actually take the moisture that it can get because of the salt effect of the fertilizer, it's going to steal that moisture away from the plant, causing seedling damage. If there's no precipitation, then you're not getting the percolation of the soil. And dry conditions can also potentially affect seeding depth and emergence. It's all over the board with different planting depths, with different soil textures, different soil topography. So making sure that you're planting deep enough to reach moisture, especially in dry conditions, and try to get as uniform emergence as possible. So we've all heard about the 4 R's in nutrient stewardship. And I always like to try to include it in presentations because those 4, source, timing, rate, and placement, they are simple questions that you can ask about your specific farm of what I can do better. Can I change my fertilizer source? Can I change my timing to maximize crop uptake and therefore profitability, ROI? When we're looking at sources for in-furrow placements, there, well, specifically for phosphorus, there are 2 forms, elemental sulfur and sulfate. Now, sulfate sulfur carries a high salt index, which means if it's placed near the seed, it's going to steal that moisture away from the roots, and it's going to cause seedling damage. Elemental sulfur, on the other hand, is inert. It has no charge. It is not a salt, which means it does not dissolve in water like sulfate, nitrate, and therefore you're not going to see that seedling burn because it's not going to steal that moisture away. Sorry, lost my train of thought there for a second. But the thing with elemental sulfur is it's not necessarily readily available to the plant right after application. It will require some moisture to be converted to sulfate and therefore taken up by the plant. But any fertilizer that is elemental sulfur will allow flexibility with applications in furrow. When we're talking about placement, again, we do not recommend sulfate or any nitrate or ammonia or fertilizers high in ammonium at high rates applied in furrow. I'm not saying that you can't, but there are higher instances of seedling damage if you do. Elemental sulfur, we specifically with the MAP plus MST product, Smart Nutrition, banding is somewhat discouraged because you want to maximize the soil to fertilizer contact so that the product will convert to sulfate and be plant available. But with that being said, split applications are a great way to be able to mitigate that. So I can apply the sulfur in furrow with, say, Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST. It's in an elemental form. It's not going to burn the plant. But then I can also make a split application as a broadcast or an additional banding application to meet those sulfur needs. Some reasons why we might not see a sulfur response whenever we apply it is because the soil contains high amounts of organic matter, or there might be sulfur left over from previous years. There's not a good soil test for an element like sulfur, especially since sulfate leaching can be in a high potential. So if you have high organic matter, you might not necessarily see a response to supplemental sulfur applications in that given year, but there is something to say about building up soil test levels to make sure that you're not limiting your crop, especially a crop like canola that uses so much, or that needs so much sulfur to maximize yields. So I want to briefly go over Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST, and then I'll get back more into the seed safety aspect and and how this product may play a role in it. But it is a very efficient delivery system for supplying a little bit of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So when we were working with the formulation of this product, we really wanted to keep the sulfur concentration as high as possible while being safe and not, causing any issues with storability. But we wanted to keep the sulfur concentration high enough that it would be in a good ratio with the phosphorus content. And I don't like to talk about nutrient management per se with applying ratios. I like to talk about ratios in fertilizer products, because one thing that we've seen in a lot of our field trials where we compare other products on the market, the sulfur content in those products are not high enough to meet sulfur needs whenever we're limiting our applications based on the phosphorus content. So 943-016, that 43% phosphorus, if I'm trying to apply fertilizer rates to meet the sulfur needs, I could potentially be over applying phosphorus, and that's going to negatively affect my ROI. But long season availability, MAP plus MST. There are several growing seasons and several geographies where where the sulfur oxidation from the elemental is going to be a little bit slower because of cooler soil temperatures. But at the end of the day, that sulfur is not subject to leaching in case in case you apply it in the fall and you get a big rainfall event, that sulfate could be potentially leached. We've got season-long availability. So in some of our growing seasons, we have suggested that you could apply Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST in furrow and then come over top with a readily available product like ammonium sulfate, and that way you've got that sulfur that's readily available. It is the latest in technology for being homogeneous as a granule. And I'll go into the actual granule here in a minute, but you can maximize production with lower tonnage because it does carry such a high fertilizer density. Now, timing. Yes, the source that you use does depend on the time of application. So for flexibility, Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST, since the majority of the sulfur is in the elemental form, you can apply it in the fall, or you can apply it in the spring and it be available that growing season. In some of the more northern regions and with cooler growing soils, again, we recommend a split application of the Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST with a sulfur or with a sulfate sulfur source like ammonium sulfate, so that you're not limiting the crop. But again, the biggest concern that I have for split applying or sulfur in general is to make sure that you're applying enough. And we'll go into total application rates here in a minute. Okay, so how it works. Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST. MST is micronized sulfur technology. And all it means is we've taken elemental sulfur and we've made it into a really fine, really small particle size. Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST as a whole, we've taken that MST and we've incorporated it into our MAP production facility. So it is a uniform granule that the slurries are mixed together before it's ever granulated. So as you can see here, you get this nice uniform distribution and very small particle sizes. Now, what that's going to do for you is, compared to, say, granular elemental sulfur, that's going to take months, even potentially years to break down and become and oxidize and become plant available. This is going to allow for earlier oxidation of the sulfur, and therefore it's available this growing season. Most of our field research shows that we're not seeing limitations on availability in that growing season per se. Other specialty products or traditional elemental sulfur products that are on the market tend to have bigger sulfur particles within the granule, and that can decrease the time that it oxidizes and becomes plant available. The product is guaranteed to be at least 15% elemental sulfur with roughly 1 to 2% sulfate. So when we're looking at seed safety, we're talking about salt index. And traditional MAP carries a salt index of around 25 to 26. Now, the higher the salt index, the more likely you are to see seedling damage with application. So ammonium sulfate. Ammonium and sulfate are both salts, which means they dissolve in water and dissociate from one another. Very high salt index. Urea, an ammonium-based nitrogen form, high salt index, which means if they get applied directly along with the seed, they could potentially cause a lot of damage. Now, MAP plus MST has a lower calculated salt index compared to MAP because as you increase that, the concentration of sulfur in the product that's inert, that's not a salt, you're taking away from the nitrogen and the phosphorus concentration. So if you think about it, you're increasing the nutrient density with a nutrient that doesn't carry a charge. So it does have a lower salt index and could be applied in with the seed. So in general, when we think about seed safety, historically, we've kind of focused more on nitrogen and potassium. Nitrogen because you can get ammonium toxicity, a lot of salt damage due to the high salt concentration of both nitrogen and potassium products. I didn't mention before, but salt index, the way it's calculated is it's compared against sodium nitrate. So assuming sodium nitrate dissolves the quickest and most efficiently in water, anything that's compared to that with a lower salt index would not dissolve as quickly as sodium nitrate. Specifically with nitrogen and potassium, how much is too much to apply? Well, if you're considering applying both of these products in furrow or close to the seed with a band, then we try to keep the total salt. So you have to include both nitrogen and potassium at a rate around 180 to 100 pounds per acre if you're doing a 2x2. So fertilizer is further away from the seed, you can apply higher rates. I mean, that's okay. But whenever you switch over and you apply it in furrow, you really need to watch the salt content and maybe only focus around 5 pounds in coarse textured soils and 8 pounds in heavy textured soils. Again, heavier textured clays will be able to pull those nutrients and hold them in the soil so they're not in a salt form anymore. Coarser textured soils, low CECs, they're not going to be able to pull those nutrients away. And moisture actually also plays a big role in this. So coarser textured soils don't tend to have as much moisture readily available there with the fertilizer. So you're not going to get that dissolving. This data actually came out of Kansas State, looking at nutrient rates of, again, nitrogen and potassium, both together by soil texture. If you're looking at row spacing, as you decrease the row spacing, you could potentially increase the amount of fertilizer that you're applying. And that has to do with seed row utilization. So as you increase your seed row width and fertilize more soil, that decreases the concentration of fertilizer that's close to the seed. And so this is when you could talk about different equipment, whether, if you've got wider spacing, like say on 30-inch centers for corn production, that's not spreading a lot of fertilizer out. That's putting it pretty, singly in a row. You're going to have to watch your fertilizer rates, because your fertilizer rates of application, if you're only on, say, a 6 to 8-inch center, you could potentially have lower fertilizer around the seed, and therefore, could do a little bit higher rates. For phosphorus, specifically in the Manitoba, Saskatchewan area, 20 pounds of phosphorus per acre seems to be the value that everyone tends to go by. In some of our field trials, however, we're trying to push the limits. We're trying to see how much phosphorus and sulfur we can apply in furrow to see if that 20-pound rate is being a little too conservative. And I don't disagree necessarily with a 20-pound of phosphorus or 20 pound of phosphorus per acre rate as a starter application, especially if it all depends on what your soil test levels are. Historically, we've seen if you have high soil test levels, then maybe just a starter application is plenty. But in cooler growing conditions, where we're going to see potential phosphorus deficiency because of those cooler soils, you're not getting the root growth, it is pertinent, it is ideal to have phosphorus in your starter applications, because you're potentially going to be limiting your yield, because that crop's going to take longer to start growing. But split applications. So if this 20-pound rate is what we are applying in furrow, keep in mind, though, that if we're looking at your total nutrient management plan and you're using a product like Smart Nutrition MAP Plus MST that has sulfur in it, this 20-pound per acre phosphorus rate, you might not be applying enough sulfur, even though as I stated before, even though the product is more balanced in the amount of phosphorus and sulfur that are applied. But consider split applications if you do go with this 20-pound per acre rate. Typical soil conditions where you might see a response to banding versus broadcast application. Again, if you have high soil test levels, you're not applying you're not applying high amounts of phosphorus this year because you've built up those soil test levels over time. Get on my soapbox for a second. I am a strong believer that there is some good in a build to maintain approach to specifically phosphorus management. Because if I build up those soil test levels, years like this year when fertilizer prices are high, maybe crop prices aren't exactly up there as well, then I probably did good in the past couple of years if I've built up those levels. So this year, maybe I can cut back and I can only apply. I say that caveat statement. I still need to apply what the crop's going to need this year and what is going to get it going and maximize production for this year. But with that being said, a split application of if I have soil test levels, if I have cold, wet soils, or maybe high textured soils that have historically had high phosphorus fixing, then maybe low pH that is causing my phosphorus to not be available. The closer I can put that fertilizer to the plant, the better off. I can potentially increase my relative yield and also come back in with a broadcast application if I need to. But again, the main point here is cooler soils you need to apply that phosphorus close to the plant so that it's not having to go back and, it's not having to go and look in the soil for it. I'm anthropomorphizing plants at this point, but but the roots are looking for nutrients. That's their goal, is to grow and survive and produce offspring. So some of our field trials, we have had a couple that, like I said earlier, that are pushing the limits of in-furrow applications, because we do kind of feel like that 20 pounds of phosphorus rate is a little more on the conservative side. But we need to watch other aspects of some of the fertilizers that we're comparing it to, because that ammonium sulfate or other competitors have such a high sulfate concentration, you won't be able to apply that much in furrow. Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST, since it is elemental, maybe we can push those to meet those phosphorus recommended rates. But I will add in another caveat statement and say that there is some justification of fertilizing more soil when it comes to phosphorus. So building up those soil test levels, fertilizing more soil. That way, if you do have a crop rotation that, say, corn and wheat, yes, I've come in and year after year I've applied in furrow fertilizer with the corn. Well, it's 30 inches apart, but you come in with wheat and that's 6 to 8 inches row spacings. Then, yeah, okay, maybe I go back out and I look at my wheat crop and I'm like, man, every 30 inches, I see a lot of growth, but not in between the what used to be the corn rows. So there is some justification to broadcast applications and building up those soil test levels over the entire field, because when we do go back in to take soil tests, that's just an average. And if I've got areas of high and low, because it is an average, there is some benefit to fertilizing more soil. Okay, but let's get back to field trials. Again, we've had some other ones, specifically last year when it was dry. It was a great year to try to pick out fertilizer in furrow application differences, and we saw astronomical responses to Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST. So it is a great source for in-furrow applications. Again, but the biggest concern that I have is to make sure that you're applying enough of all the nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus included, to maximize production. This was a study that was conducted at Langham, and they're in Saskatoon. Saskatchewan. And treatments were applied as a side band at planting. The zero sulfur control had no sulfur applied, but there was a MAP applied in addition to urea to meet those phosphorus and nitrogen needs. So the only difference that should be between that treatment and the rest of them is the addition of sulfur. So we're actually looking for a sulfur response, which actually this was a good year to actually see a sulfur response to additions of ammonium sulfate, MAP plus MST, the blend of MAP plus MST and ammonium sulfate. Again, just because we realize that if you're applying Smart Nutrition in furrow at that 20-pound rate, we need to make sure that we come in with ammonium sulfate so that the plant has that sulfate that's readily available. And then a competitor product, MES 15, comparable in sulfur concentration. So we didn't see a lot of differences between the fertilizer sources. We did see a slight yield decrease with the MAP plus MST. Again, cooler soils, you're not going to see those oxidation rates as high as warmer soils. especially, I'm in Kansas, the soil temperatures in the spring, as soon as they start warming up, they skyrocket with oxidation rates and conversion. But cooler textured soil or cooler soils, you're not going to get those oxidation rates. So it's a good idea to come in with an ammonium sulfate. And you could do this with another band with the planter pass. You could do this as a broadcast application, even right before planting in some crops. There are options. But the sulfur in the MAP plus MST would allow for availability later in the growing season. We've talked a lot about specific rates for in furrow, but I always try to include this for applying the right rate for the yield that you're going for. So as you increase yield potential, guess what? You're going to be removing more nutrients, and specifically a nutrient like sulfur, since there's not a good soil test because it is mobile, since sulfate is mobile within the soil profile, we really need to look at removal rates for determining our application rates the subsequent year. So if anything, we need to make sure that we're at least applying what we're removing. And if not more, in some instances with nutrients like, say, potassium and phosphorus, where I could build up soil test levels. If I build up soil test levels to, I may not necessarily see a fertilizer response, but that's a good thing. That's kind of where we want farmers to be. We don't necessarily want to see a yield bump in the field because this row got plugged up or this row got missed, or we don't want to see those types of things in the field. So building up those soil test levels can be beneficial for a lot of crops. Specifically for canola, 50 bushels. I mean, you're looking at 80 pounds of nitrogen, 40 pounds of phosphorus, 20 pounds of potassium, and somewhere between 12 and 15 pounds of sulfur. Again, that 40 pounds of phosphorus, you'll have some in the soil, but if you're focusing around that 20 pounds per acre rate to go in furrow, you could be potentially limiting your phosphorus. And if you use a product like Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST, you may need to apply more sulfur because you're only hitting about half of what your rate should be. I left this in here just because it's good information, but nitrogen to sulfur ratios, each crop has a specific ratio that the plant needs to maximize protein content. So high protein crops like soybeans, canola, where you're trying to maximize the protein content, you need to be aware that you may need to apply more sulfur to meet those, to maximize your nitrogen applications. Okay, Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST, nutrient dense fertilizer. Again, I can't say enough how many times we've seen in field trials where some of the other products on the market are over applying phosphorus because we can't apply enough to reach those sulfur application needs. So MAP plus MST having 16% sulfur and 43% phosphorus, that's a 68% nutrient dense fertilizer. That's going to lower your transportation costs. That's going to maximize bin space. That's going to allow you to cover more acres per volume of fertilizer. And it's just going to be more efficient for your system. And having a product that is versatile in application. So being able to apply it in the fall, being able to apply it in furrow, those will help also with less trips over the field. But again, make sure that we're applying enough fertilizer to maximize production. Nutrien is committed to safety. Again, we wanted to increase the sulfur content as much as possible in the product while remaining as safe as possible. But the Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST product you still have to wear the PEE of handling fertilizer because it can irritate the skin. So wear gloves, wash your skin. It's not flammable. The dust that is produced in transportation and handling is not an explosion hazard. We've done quite a bit of third-party testing to make sure that it is a safe product. For storability, since the sulfur is present in the elemental form, it's not going to absorb the moisture that a salt would. Same concept, kind of with salt index and storability. It's not going to absorb the moisture out of the atmosphere. So it's great and ideal for humid environments or mixing with urea for, say if we want to make a broadcast application. So big on performance. Again, particle size of 15 microns, it's 10 to 15. That allows for quicker oxidation, earlier crop availability, decreased risk of leaching. This, if you applied it this past fall, as soil temperatures cool down, you're not going to get the oxidation rates, so that fertilizer is going to be there this spring. So once it starts warming up, you'll get that oxidation and it'll become plant available. It's ideal for bulk blending. Again, being able to mix it with urea in high humid environments, big plus. Limited moisture accumulation, and the slow release provides sulfur throughout the entire growing season. Again, there are some growing areas where we did see some limitations of sulfur availability due to oxidation, but we highly recommend split applications with another fertilizer source like ammonium sulfate, so that plant has what it needs when it needs it. Reduced salt index delivers seed row safety. High analysis for decreased application rates. Again, safe to handle and store. Enhanced product combining phosphorus and sulfur. Very homogeneous. That means you're going to have pretty consistent nutrient percentages. It's not a layering process. It's not like other products on the market. You will get that even distribution within the granule. Okay. With that being said, thank you all for joining in. And for anybody who needs more information, please check out smartnutritionmst.com or send us an email at mst@nutrien.com. And I will go ahead and throw up the QR code. If you have any questions or concerns about your CEU credits, let us know.
Yeah, thanks, Christy. That was a great presentation. We can jump into a bit of a question and Q&A period here. We got a few that came through, and like I said before, if there's any other questions, feel free to type them in that questions tab at the bottom. I can give some instructions on the CEU credit after the fact. So first one I got here is, how is fertilizer seed safety determined? I think we answered that, but if you could go back, I think that was good.
Yeah, so seed safety is really determined by the salt index of the fertilizer. And again, that seed bed utilization, really trying to focus in on how much of the soil I'm fertilizing with the fertilizer and the seed. One concern that I've been hearing from a lot of farmers is, okay, or they say with wheat, early planting, it leads to higher yields. But if for some reason I don't get out and I don't plant my wheat early enough, then what can I do? And a lot of times that the answer is, changing your seeding application. But if you're planting late, we strongly suggest, even if you're planting early, we always strongly suggest that you apply some type of starter fertilizer that contains at least phosphorus. That way it helps with winter tillering. It helps develop that root system in the fall, allows it to overwinter. If you're applying it or if you're planting in the spring, definitely having phosphorus close to the plant is key for cooler soils where the roots might take a little bit more time. Even clay pan soils or mucky soils that you might have decreased root growth. Having that starter fertilizer near the plant is ideal, but do it in a safe manner. Choose the right sources, use the right calculations for trying to figure out how much to apply. I feel like I went off on a tangent on that one, but I think I reined it back in. Sorry,
Yes,
Quentin.
sure. No problem. I got a good one that came through here. How much AMS do you recommend adding to an in-furrow blend with MAP plus MST in canola?
Okay. So
Yeah.
yeah, do that one more time.
How much AMS do you recommend adding to an in-furrow blend with MAP plus MST in canola?
Okay. We don't really, let me just preface by saying we don't really recommend ammonium sulfate in furrow at high rates, because the sulfur or the salt content would be entirely way too high. But if I'm sticking around that 20 pound of phosphorus rate, that's only going to supply maybe 6 to 8 pounds of sulfur. Oh my gosh, got it. It's Wednesday morning, got to do the calculation to try to figure out how much ammonium sulfate to get to that 12 to 15 pound of sulfur range. Probably wouldn't suggest applying it in furrow. Would look at other methods, a different banding a little bit further away from the seed if 2x2 is an option, or side banding, surface banding, or even a broadcast application.
Perfect. Next one, what is the current maximum recommended rate for seed placed fertilizer?
Yeah, so for seed placed fertilizer, again, for nitrogen and potassium, it really depends on your soil texture. If you've got heavier textured soils or muck soils, you could get away with higher rates, because that soil is the soil itself has a charge, and it will hold on to those nutrients and pull them away from the seed. That way you don't get the seed damage. It also depends on how much moisture if we could all be able to plan the weather and be able to know what's going to happen, that would be great. So that's why I try to focus on the soil texture, because you don't know if it's going to rain or not. But if it's dry, then you may need to back off of your application rates in furrow. But it seems like that 20 pounds of phosphorus in furrow, I feel like that's conservative. I feel like that value has always been because phosphorus levels were high. Canadian farmers have done a really good job of focusing on sulfur, specifically because you have crops that are utilizing it. In the US, on the other hand, we're starting to see more sulfur deficiency because we are mining the soils. We're not getting the sulfur deposition that we once were, and we're needing to apply more. Same concept. I feel like that 20 pound rate was established with maybe phosphorus fertilizer sources that did cause seedling damage. And so you had to keep the rate lower. And B, because natural phosphorus levels within the soil have been mined year after year, because that rate isn't high enough. So we need to take another look to make sure that we're applying enough phosphorus.
Perfect. Another one, what conditions affect seed safe products and rates?
The number one on the fertilizer, on the fertilizer side, is salt index. On soil conditions, it's abiotic stresses. It's soil moisture, soil texture. I would even throw in, seedling depth, what you're planning for uniform emergence. Those types of things where you're putting the fertilizer can also be a condition that a farmer would need to pay attention to. I want to reiterate the machinery aspect of it. So if you have wide spacing, but you're only applying, say right behind the planter, then you're not getting a lot of fertilizer mixing. So you're having high amounts of fertilizer right near the seed, and that could potentially cause damage. But if you're, say, planting wheat and you're at that 6 to 8 inch opening, then you're fertilizing more soil, so it could be diluted, and you have lower fertilizer rates that wouldn't cause as much seedling damage. Those are my top conditions or considerations.
I covered a lot there. Yeah. We got a few more questions, but I think I'm just going to pass those along to you, and then you can maybe email directly to answer the last couple here. So that's going to be the end of that. And before we end today, here's your chance to collect one CCA CEU. You've probably seen the QR code on the screen here. CEU in nutrient management. To collect the credit for the webinar, please open your CCA app on your smartphone, click scan course code, and hold your phone up to the monitor so the camera can hover over the QR code. If you want to bring that up again one more time, we'll just make sure everyone got that covered there. If you're able to do this, your CEU will be submitted immediately. If this does not work for you, please email your first name and last name and CCA number to topcrop@annexbusinessmedia.com, and we'll submit your credit for you. These instructions will also be found in our follow-up email, which will hold the recording of the webinar. Thanks for tuning in today to today's webinar, and don't forget to visit topcropmanager.com/webinars to view all our previously recorded webinars. Thanks.